Why is it that religious buildings are so connected conceptually to beautiful buildings in a way that buildings that, I won't call them atheist buildings, it seems like a strange concept, but buildings that don't have any kind of religious connection seem not to have that beauty in the same way. At least that's what people think. I don't know if it's true.
So there are a few things to mention. One is the way that kind of traditional societies function. The best way to understand it for a modern person is to understand it as a kind of fractal situation, a fractal system of center and periphery, and inside and outside, unity and multiplicity. And so the church acts as a locus of unity for a village. Like if you take, let's say, a small town, there's a church in the small town. The church is usually in a central space, if not in the actual center of the church of the town. It is taller than the other buildings for a reason, because it is the vector of unity. So we're all there, and if we look around, the thing that we see that's taller than everything else is actually the thing that binds us together as a community. And so we go there, we celebrate the things that bind us together, the things that unify us, the things that are related to our origins. So we have weddings and baptisms and deaths, and all of these things we celebrate at the place that binds us together. So there's an actual coherence to the way in which it's a medieval city would manifest themselves, which is with this building at the middle. And so you can understand it as kind of like an offering to what binds us together. So for the same reason that you would make yourself, let's say, well-dressed to go to a wedding, or that you would decorate the house for a Christmas meal, you are offering your excess up to something which binds you together. And so it becomes like a shining beacon of your unity, right? And so it's on the one hand, a sense of sacrifice, where we're sacrificing this excess into something which binds us together and up towards something which transcends us. But then it also becomes an image of our unity. That's why it's usually not an individual building, especially like the more medieval churches. It's something which happens over time, right? It happens over a century, 2 centuries. The church is an organic part of the unity of the town itself. It's not just an artistic statement or the way we understand how we make art today. And it's not even just architecture. It is that, right? It's a beacon of unity, maybe best way to understand it.
But I suppose, and I agree with you, and it's fascinating. And maybe that's why, if you look at an old town hall, for example, which isn't quite a secular church, but perhaps the idea of a town hall is that it's supposed to be something like the place where everybody comes together. These buildings also tend to be quite beautiful and well put together and designed almost as if they could be transformed into churches. But I don't see why it is the case that when somebody's building a skyscraper, I understand, residential blocks and functionally trying to house people, but if you're building the Shard, London's tallest building, I mean, sure, there's a sense in which the Shard is quite pretty. It's a slightly explorative form of art, but some of these skyscrapers, the walkie-talkie, these seem to be. I don't understand why it is the case that they can't also have a similar devotion to beauty that would have existed in something like an old church. Like, why is it? I understand why every now and again you build a skyscraper, somebody takes a risk and it goes wrong. But it seems like every skyscraper we build is an exercise. It's like testing people's assumptions about the subjectivity of art. It's like, it's like God is laughing at us in saying that, when we decide that beauty is subjective and it's just your opinion, man, he's like, well, try living here for a couple of years.
Yeah, let's just see what happens if you do
see
live
how it
that
goes,
way.
see how you like it. But I don't understand why that's the case. Like, why does this happen?
Yeah. Well, it is in the secularist approach itself. It's bound in that, which is that if you live in a world in which questioning your suppositions about things, questioning your presuppositions about things, and critical thinking is that which is worshipped, like the idea that criticizing is more powerful, and there's a kind of smartness of criticizing, and there's a kind of naive stupidity of believing and having faith in something. If you believe something, if you have faith in something, you should have you should be cynical about it, right? You should be cynical about the things that bind us together. And so this is woven through our society at all kinds of levels, right? It's not just, it happens on the one hand in the technologies, which provides us with all kinds of technologies, but it also happens in the social space, which means that every year there's a new theory about how humans work, and it's completely new and it's revolutionary, and we never thought of it before, and it just happens every single every cycle. Our education system, for example, here in Quebec, has had reforms like every 5 years for the past 3 decades, constantly reforming the way in which we do things. So it's an approach to reality which gives the results that it gives, which is this. It's also part of what it also gives us fashion. And fashion is hilarious because obviously fashion on your clothes is easy to, because you're going to throw your clothes away and you move out. But fashion in buildings is the funniest thing ever. So you have these fashions of buildings and house building that just run through society. And then 20 years or 30 years later, you look at it like your grandfather's shag carpeting as something kitschy and horrible to look at. So.
Yeah, I suppose in architecture, although there are architectural fashions, I wonder, and I don't know, as much about architecture as I'd like. It's something I'm trying to learn about, and I wonder if people are aware that they are engaging in a fashion. I mean, if you're making clothing, you'll understand when you're producing these clothes that you are playing into something like a fashion. But I imagine that people constructing buildings aren't thinking in that way. It's only retrospectively that we look at fashions.
It's progress is what it is. People think they're engaging in progress, but what they're actually doing is engaging in fashion. People will connect technological progress with moral progress and artistic progress together. And they have this sense in which we're moving forward and we're progressing. It seems, to be honest, like at this point, only the most naive people could still believe that, but nonetheless, it's so ingrained in our thinking. This idea of progress is so bound up in our thinking that it just happens. It's a program running through human thinking. And when people see something different, they see it as good in itself. There's also this idea that innovation is an untrammeled good. Innovation is a good in itself. There's no question about it. So we think that in technology, we think that in all kinds of ways. And then we also think that in art, the idea that because something is new and because it's something that I haven't seen before, it is therefore a good. That is, of course, I think, ridiculous. It's a ridiculous idea. That is, human goodness and human capacity to participate in goodness is based on how humans are made. It's based on human nature, and the idea that just because something is new makes it necessarily good, I think is a problem running through human society in general right now.
Do you think there's a similar bias going on in the opposite direction, where people assume that because something is old, it is beautiful, and because something is old, it is worth preserving? I mean, we were talking earlier about the pyramids. I think the closest example I can think of to a modern pyramid is, have you seen this orb, the sphere in Las Vegas?
Yeah, the sphere in Las Vegas.
The Las Vegas sphere, this, and thank goodness they built it in Las Vegas, because it makes sense there. Okay, it's this huge, for people who don't know, it's this, I don't know how big it is, but it's absolutely, gargantuan sphere. And on both sides, the inside and the outside, it's covered in thousands and thousands of LEDs. It's like the most LEDs all in one place. And so you go inside this huge orb, and the entire the building, the entire sky above you can be made to look like whatever you like. And it's such high definition that it absorbs you into any world you like. And on the outside, it's obviously just this big sphere. And there are LEDs on the outside as well. And so they put like a smiley face and welcome to Vegas. And then, of course, in absolutely no time, advertising. It's
of course.
It's a gigantic billboard. It's a monster. Okay, fine. It works in Vegas. They were trying to build one in London as well, and I think that the mayor said no.
Thank you.
And then I think to myself, okay, obviously a disaster, just a disastrous idea to put something like that in maybe not in Vegas, but basically anywhere else. Thing is, 2,000-3,000 years from now, future societies are sort of doing excavations on this ancient city of London, and they're all looking at this massive orb, and they don't know what it was built for. Was it a tomb? Was it a church? Was it somewhere people lived? Was it? We don't know. Isn't that a great mystery? How the hell did they put this thing together?
So,
I mean, people would travel from across the world to come and see what we are now find so offensive to our artistic taste that the mayor actually said it can't be built. But you understand that people would be flying from across the globe to come and see this, right? Just because it's old.
Let me push back a little against your idea that it's old. So a way to understand the fact that old things survive is to understand it actually through a Darwinian process, to understand it through a kind of evolutionary process, which is that humans propose things, right? They propose buildings, they propose literature, they propose poems, and there's a kind of variability in the proposal. There's some variability and some kind of messiness in that happening. And then what happens is that then humans remember certain things and preserve certain things. And it doesn't happen over a thousand years. It happens over a few decades. And over a few decades, some things are preserved and some things are not. And some things are maintained and some things are not. And also some things are cared about and some things aren't. So if you create a building, let's say 1,000 years ago, and people care for it, they are impressed by it, they love it, and they want to maintain it, it will preserve itself. So there are so many buildings that have been destroyed for thousands of years, but there are some that are preserved, and those are not preserved for arbitrary reasons. And they're not preserved over 2,000 years; they're preserved over decade, year after year after year. And that, I think, is a somewhat of a guarantee. It's not 100% guarantee, but it's somewhat of a guarantee that mechanism that is manifesting itself is telling you what human attention is made of, just intuitively. You don't even have to rationally understand it. You just understand that it's an expression of something true about how humans engage with the world. And so that's why I do believe that it's not just that something is old, but it's that something has been kept and preserved and maintained, for all this time.
Yes, I think that makes sense. I'm interested in what you think. Humans, we were talking earlier about iconography. Humans seem obsessed with making icons. They love making icons. And in fact, in the old scriptural tradition, part of the problem is that, Moses pops up to the mountain and comes back down, and then they've made a new icon. It's like they can't stop making icons all the time. That doesn't go away just because we don't believe in God anymore. Society is secularizing and all that. What do you think are the icons of the secular age?
Yeah. Well, so there's a way, I think especially in Christian theology, like what we'll do is we will separate the difference between icon and idol. And the difference between an icon and idol is that the icon affords the transcendent. That is, it is pointed to. It is not something which stops at itself, but rather leads up towards higher participation. So it's like if I encounter an image of Saint John the Baptist, well, the image of Saint John the Baptist only exists in my life because he pointed to Christ, and that image of Christ only exists in my life because he pointed to the infinite, invisible, transcendent. And so that is the way that icons function. They're a kind of ladder of participation. The idea about idols is that in some ways they are factitious. They try to capture it all in themselves, right? They try to kind of capture your attention and keep it within its sphere. The idol doesn't offer itself up to a higher participation. And so I would say that in our world now, we are surrounded with idols constantly. That is, we are constantly asked to give our attention to things in ways which are purely subservient to the thing itself, right? Advertising itself has a form of idolatry to it because the sometimes advertising can be pointing to a higher good, but most of the time it's not. Most of the time it's just like buy this thing, it will accomplish all your desires. I will give you what you want if you get this thing. And so there's a sense in which if I can just get that, then I will get what I want. And that's the way in which, idols are represented in the Old Testament. If you look at that story of the calf, the golden calf, for example, right? It's like Moses goes up to get the revelation. People down here were like, well, we need something here. We need something to kind of gather us together. They make this golden calf, and then they have an orgy, basically. It's like the idol affords you your desires. And so that's why it's related to, that's why it can be related to anything that you give your attention to too much, whether it's, porn, whether it's alcohol, all the classical things that can capture you and can become your God for all intents and purposes.
But I mean, would it be right to say that pornography or alcohol are idols? And the thing that people do with idols is that they worship them. And I suppose another thing that I'm a bit unclear on is what it means to worship something.
Yeah.
And can I worship this microphone? Can I worship?
And you could
drink,
it'd be a little, yeah, it would be a little ridiculous. So that is, the worship is the best way to understand worship is you could say that it is the highest point of your attention, right? It is the point of attention in which there is no higher. It doesn't fit into a higher good. So a good example, like this is not woo woo. Like I don't want to be careful people to think like, oh, here, what's Jonathan talking about, right? So it's like you're making food and you're cutting the onions, right? You give attention to that, but that attention is bound in the recipe that you're making. And the making of that recipe is bound in the fact that you're going to sit together as a family and eat. And that sitting together as a family and eat is bound into the love of the family itself as something which provides, and then you can keep scaling that up all the way up to the highest good, which is the infinite transcendent. And so there are some things in the world that are more in danger of capturing our attention fully. And, and it's just by the nature of who we are. It's obviously a microphone. It would be difficult for you to worship a microphone. It'd be harder, but alcohol is the good. It's fine, but it can become a god. And we know people for who it does become a god, and it does kind of take over their lives. And it's the same with, I wouldn't say pornography, but I would say sex. Let's say sexuality is obviously something good, but it has to be ordered in a certain way for it to not become something that traps you and kind of takes over your attention, so that you can't think of other things, and you can't let's say put your attention into higher, and everybody knows it, like especially if you remember when you were, I'm older now, but when I was 19 or whatever, right? It was really difficult to think. You think about sex all the time. It would take over your field of experience. You would see the world through the lens of sex, right? You would notice things, and the world would kind of organize itself in that way. And that can be dangerous, because that's not actually how the world works. The world isn't only made of sex. It's made of all kinds of other things that have to fit together towards higher goods.
I mean, there's of course a sense in which it makes sense as an atheist thinking about evolutionary biology, why people just become obsessed with sex in this way. I mean, it is the mechanism by which things are created. It seems less natural to me, in other words, to suppress that in order to focus our attention on what the religious will say is really the creative power here. This is the real force that we should be focusing on. Why is it such a... in other words, if worship is supposed to be directed towards the transcendent and God, then why is it such an unnatural experience for so many people? Why is it so difficult?
Well, it'd be interesting to even take the way that you say sex. I think that even using evolutionary structures, being obsessed with the act and the pleasure of sex is actually counterproductive to the evolutionary goals, because the survival of the species is not bound up only in the orgasm. Like there's a whole buffer around that, which has to do with the rearing of children, especially in terms of how humans deal with children. There's a whole structure around that which has to do with the rearing of children and the familial relationships which will assure the continuation of your line, however you want to think of it. And so the buffer around sexuality is already a constraint on the pleasure of sexuality. One of the problems that we have now, you could say, is that technology in some ways affords something which was impossible in an ancient world, right? Affords unlimited access to insane amounts of stimulus, of sexual stimulus, that in some ways can overpower a person in a way that is not conducive to evolutionary questions. And the proof of that is that, let's say, pornography leads to decline in population to some extent. It leads to erection problems. It leads to all these difficulties that will not bring about the continuation. And so the religious is the highest point of understanding that the smallest good that I feel, whether it's the pleasure of eating, the pleasure of sex, these different pleasures have to be encased and have to be constrained into higher goods. And to some extent, for you to even have those, right? If you want sexuality to be pleasure and not just a master that kind of overwhelms you, it has to be bound into these higher goods. And it's the same with food. If you just eat food for pleasure, at some point you will no longer have pleasure eating food. If you only have sex for pleasure, at some point you will no longer have pleasure in sex. In order for the thing to be good, it has to be kind of embedded into these higher participation.
Yeah, if it no longer points towards something more, or is done with the sort of attention focus towards something else and something more, then I suppose, like you were saying a moment ago, it becomes an idol rather than an icon. It becomes an end rather than a window through which to look at what really is beautiful and true. Fascinating. And I did want to ask, since you mentioned it a moment ago, I mean, when talking in these terms, you say, well, I've got to be careful here because I don't want to be accused of just, wooing, just speaking woo-woo. I see this all the time. Whenever you approach the topic of religion, and we haven't really talked about religion per se, existence of God, the traditional apologetic stuff, but whenever you try to approach that conversation from anything other than, I guess, an analytic philosophical tradition, this accusation often comes up, and it seems like this is something that's been levied at you. Where do you think that criticism comes from? Do you think there's, the fact that you recognize while you're saying words that this may sound to people like I'm just sort of talking nonsense?
Yeah. Well,
why do you feel the need to issue that disclaimer? In other words,
to some extent, it really is the fault of religious people. To some extent, is that in the 19th and 20th century, many religious people have become what is something like, practically they are materialists and they are rationalists practically, but they continue to maintain. Let's take New Earth creationism, for example, right? That's a good example where it's like people who think that Genesis 1 is a scientific text, and then they insist on that. And then and then at some point what happens is that they cease to understand what these terms are about. And so they don't know what it means, what heaven means. They don't know what spirit means. They don't know what any of these things mean. And they have no connection to the ancient way of thinking. And so then, they've made the language completely abhorrent to people. So it's like when you hear certain words, when people hear certain words like spirit, for example, that's a good example. People hear the word spirit, they just roll their eyes in the back of their head because they think you're just not talking about anything. You're talking about ectoplasm or some ridiculous like spiritualist material thing that was invented in the modern age. And so in some ways, religious people are to blame for what happened, and the fact that now people just look at this stuff and say exactly like, oh, so a big guy on the sky, it's like, and I want to be careful. It's like some of the religious people that have this thing, usually they're misrepresenting a deep intuition that is real, but they're misrepresenting it in the way that they deal with it. Like I had an example with someone that I care for very much, but was kind of like this kind of materialist thing. And I asked him, I said, when Jesus went up into heaven, where did he go? Did he go into the clouds? Did he go into the moon? Like, where did he go? And the person literally said, I never thought about that. And I thought, well, then if you've never thought about that, but you have this weird kind of scientific materialism about you, then we're in trouble, my friend, because like just with one question, I could undo your faith. Like I could destroy your entire worldview with one question. And so, we have to be able to look at this in a different way, let's just say.
So where is it that the atheist, rationalist, analytic type critic of your religious worldview most fundamentally goes wrong in terms of their approach?
No, but I think it's exactly they do the same as the kind of materialist Christian, is that they think that there's a certain way to describe reality and there's only one. And it tends to equate itself to a kind of, let's say, a forensic description of a crime, right? That's the best way to understand it. It's like they think that everything is something like a forensic description. But the reality is that it isn't. That's just not how reality works. Forensic descriptions have a certain purpose, but most of the time you do not use forensic descriptions. Most of the time you use what people call heuristics, which I hate that term, by the way. But that people use mechanisms of meaning in order to get to their meaning. And so if we don't understand the types of mechanisms of meaning that religion is involved in, then at some point we're just talking past each other and we don't know what's happening. And like I said, religious people are to blame often for that, because they themselves have, at least in the modern age, forgotten the structure of the ancient cosmologies. Like, they haven't read Dante, they haven't read the Church Fathers, they don't know they don't know anything about scholasticism, they don't know anything about the metaphysics of Christianity. They just have this kind of first level understanding.
So talking about where people go wrong is one thing. I recently had a conversation with John Vervaeke, who was talking about one of the problems that we face is that people don't have anywhere to go for wisdom. A lot of podcasts, they have the sort of the one question that they ask every single one of their guests at the end of the episode or whatever. And I was thinking I might trial that by ending the podcast asking you, where do you go for wisdom?
Where do I go for wisdom? And so I do believe that tradition offers wisdom well understood. That is not tradition in the idea of data that is transmitted from one generation to the other. But what tradition offers is mostly the mode of being from one generation to another. And so I do believe that tradition offers wisdom, and that includes, of course, Scripture, the Church Fathers, but then also the liturgical life, this type of mode of being that comes from, that has been preserved through all these generations. I think that offers wisdom.
Well, Jonathan Pageau, thank you so much for joining me.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks.